11-page stories.
Written through L.T. Zupan. Read by L.T. Zupan.
Story number 5. Vigorous indigenous. 1 Many years ago, a long time past, there was once a gentle, nameless woman. She belonged to a stone-carving, cave-dwelling, beautiful and harmonious family. They lived on an island that later came to be known as Zemaka. They could not remember where they came from. This mother of the family was also the local shaman. She was up late one night having intense visions and the like, while the rest of her family slept contentedly. What she experienced, among other things, fashioned itself into a seed when it was complete. And so, around 4 a.m., this woman became crystallized in a pyramid of thought. It correlated as a type of reflection-ish thing with recent ongoings in her own consciousness as personal life. First was the realization of universally ubiquitous peristaltic hunger. Next, steps beyond it, on the top, she perceived the eye of awareness, and ultimately came an epiphany of the relationship between the two. Hunger feeding the eye, and the eye guiding the hunger. She gratefully noticed that the eye had more power, as a world guided by primordial hunger was none too inviting to her. Now, normally, this would have been more than enough for her. But a voice came from some other solar system and began whispering to her that she needed to take it one step further, and so she did. And that changed everything. She stretched and stood, then hunkered over to her family. The woman snuggled in with all of them and peacefully went off to sleep. That early morning, her dreams were relatively and alternately mellow. 2 Many years later, a man, who would later be called the Buddha by many, was sitting on the grass near a fair-sized tree. He had been in the habit of teaching the many others for some time now, and at random times he often went into a trance. Later he would come to be fully enlightened, as the humans would then call it, as fitting of a term as any, he would have thought. The trance he was now in was a relatively and alternately mellow one. A sharp seed suddenly pierced into his awareness, almost as if it had been sent from light years away. He broke his trance with fresh instructions ready for his constant companion listeners and self-proclaimed students, many of whom would later go on to become self-proclaimed scholars. The lesson was simple. Often we hunger for energy and information from others, particularly a very particular certain strata of others. Often we hunger enough that we try to pull or magnetize too quickly, without regard for the state of comfort of the ones from which we pull. 3 Around 500 years later, a man named Jesus publicly affirmed this teaching, along with a few new teachings, and put his life on the line for its validity. Around 500 years later, still, a man named Muhammad publicly codified and expanded upon that same teaching, along with a few new teachings. He had the immense courage and self-sacrifice to put forth in the Quran as thus: "It is ultimately ordered from God the fact that it is also in our own self-interest to care about the comfort of others when possible, and generally when those others also care. Taking the time to magnetize gently what you gather, in terms of information and energy from others, leads to a non-localized harmony and ultimately to a satisfying reality for all those concerned. Certain realities and experiences are more desirable than others. Not being decent to others does lead to a reality and an experience that we don't really want. Keeping that realization with you at all times possible is very definitely a top priority, in so many words. 4 dash dash dash. Around 500 years later, even still, in the year of 1187 AD, a woman named Tora sits on a cliff overlooking the ocean on the island of Zemaka, which could have had its name warped into Jamaica in some other alternative reality, perhaps. Many things had changed in the world that current readers may now know as Earth. Many more people had now learned to be more decent and way less aggressive on the whole. They had discovered what truly satisfied them. This was a global phenomenon, which included both the indigenous peoples of the New World as well as the many European explorers abounding. Slavery and exploitation was no longer the idea for most men. Indigenous people throughout the planet were also more united and less prone to warlike behavior amongst their own independent nations and tribes. Also, technology was several centuries ahead of its time. Torah was a gentlewoman and the direct descendant of a pre-Arawak stone-carving, cave-dwelling, nameless shaman mother, who lived on Zemaka so very long ago, and who was also a very gentle, kind, understanding, and brilliant woman. It ran in the family and through their deep red blood, although Tora was a shaman of far greater power than any that had come before or after her. Her home was with her husband and their farming family. She was a pillar of the community, and she was lucky enough to live directly on the coast. Just 3 weeks prior, she had turned 24 years old. She sat on their land with the nearby shore spread out below her and sang softly to herself. The tune carried prophetic magic along its waves and etherical apertures. Something was calling. That she knew. Torah was the last prophet, at least the last prophet that would inhabit one singular human body. Off into the distance, she spotted a vessel. The boat was huge, and it had a strange flag on it, colored red, blue, and white. 5 dash dash dash. A few minutes later, and Tora was running back to the main dwelling on their land. It was a sturdy structure that had been built with love and materials gathered meticulously from the earth at nearby plots, forests, and even markets, for some of those harder to find elements. She had personally blessed the house with the help of her eldest daughters and her husband. She ran faster. She was staving off a frenzy. 6 dash dash dash. At the same time, a man named Giovanni di Verrazzano was on a boat, and he couldn't believe it. There was land. He never thought he would see the day. 7 dash dash dash. By the time they had anchored ashore and majorly deboarded, a conflagration of around 25 villagers could be seen off into the distance. Giovanni gazed slowly around at his party with an excited, jovial, yet, don't fuck this up, austere sort of a look. Tora had already covered those sorts of bases with her group. It seemed everyone was already on the same page, before they had even met. Slowly, the groups walked nearer to each other. It became obvious how very differently they were clothed. Still, the attire was most sensible on both sides. Tora and Verrazzano broke apart and ahead slightly from the rest of their respective crowds. They stood 10 feet away from each other, staring. Everyone stopped walking and fell silent. The ocean lapped its waves in the background. It was a beautiful morning. 8 dash dash dash. After a few long moments, Giovanni was forced to divert his eyes from Tora. He simply could not hold his gaze with the depth of fire in her eyes. So he did the only decent and respectful thing he could think of to do. He looked downward at the ground. After a few intense moments, he could feel the others in his crew looking at him, and it was beginning to severely bother him. So Giovanni forced his eyes back up, level with her. He smiled the kindliest way he knew and stuck out his hand as he slowly advanced towards her. She carefully advanced towards him, too. In an effort to be diplomatic, she copied his gesture with her hand. When they got near, he gently shook her hand and said, "Hi, pleased to meet you," in his native language. It was the decent thing to do. Tora did not know Italian or French, and Giovanni did not know Arawakan, but they both knew that everyone looked borderline ravenous. Tora motioned for one of her daughters to produce a bread basket, and she displayed some fresh loaves of leavened bread for the strange people on the seaside. Giovanni smiled and had his second officer procure some stowed pasta and spiced fishes to show to the island folk. Everyone muttered and some people laughed a little. It was decided. Tora led the entire group back to her farm to feast. It was the beginning of something that was fair and good. 9 Through the course of the next 5 years, 2 continents, which included many islands similar to Zemaka, were discovered, explored, and mapped out by the Europeans that came after Giovanni. A variety of languages were learned by many. Peaceful agreements were made, and largely kept by both sides. The New World came to be known by all as Tora Verrazano. It was initially divided in label only into North, South, and Central regions. The island of Zemaka, in the Central North region, quickly grew into a very large city on the site where Giovanni had first landed. It came to be known as Tora Town, the capital city of the United Countries of Tora Verrazano. The names had multitudinous rings to them. Very quickly, massive amounts of people everywhere realized the potential for exchange and mutual benefit. Settlers started pouring in from overseas. Most of the indigenous did not want to leave their land, but there still were some who left on quest to adventure the old world. 10 From the first moment she had seen Giovanni's tiny, magnificent flag hoisted on his dark and complex, large wooden vessel, Tora had been profoundly inspired, actually rather moved even. For the next 25 years, her position amongst the people on all sides had solidly elevated. She was becoming much like the George Washington of our dimension, minus a lot of the hypocrisy and all of the extreme biting dental pain. Tora came to oversee the installation of many newly required glorious institutions throughout the lands. Amazing things were happening, and few stood in the way of progress, at least at first. Shamans, priests, witches, clerics, and lay people were educating each other, studying and practicing together, giving birth to new faiths, traditions, rituals, religions, ceremonies, and etc. Powerful love and electric sex gave unto all, similar to the first few bites of a panini, where you just don't realize how hungry you were until it's all over now. Equatable to the bridging of quantum physics and Hindu mysticism in our pleasantly sickened timeline, technology was also synergized. Various skill sets for the practical were exchanged and intertwined. Both sides found missing components from the other. It all started to make sense. The arts all but instantly exploded in the best of ways. Tora was perhaps the greatest pioneer in that field. She knew she had been born for it. Rhythms came right up from the ground for her, eloquently bent into the appropriate tool shapings dwelling within her. Melodies danced about on the wind, singing sharply as she plucked them and gently placed them into her latest sonic bouquet. Her music was pure magic. New crossbreedings of innumerable plants and animals were thoughtfully incepted, fostered. The high-tech newcomers brought an amusing novelty and a very real excitement to the ageless souls of the indigenous, who forgave their crass nature and shared simple forms of eternal peace with them. Most everyone had merely done what was right, and as a result, all was well in the world. 11 Deep inland, somewhere in South Tora of Arizona, lived the sharpest of deserts. Through into the stopped vibe of it all rested a deciduous pocket of pine tree folk. The forest elevated itself to around 400 yards above the level sea, and even managed to get fairly cold for around 2 months out of every year. People harped along and passed the stones of every hour meaninglessly and with full sway. It was too mysterious to be funny and too light-hearted to be explained to most outsiders. But a man named John had ventured in a few years before, and he had seemed to fit in. No one bothered to learn each other's languages. They had little huts they all felt at home in. For the fuck of it, John had revelated and erected a small cubic brick outdoor storage suitcase-like thing last year. The ground was golden with a peaceful, powerful, musty feeling of a forest floor from all the burnt-out olden pine needles. There's a war coming, John. You can smell it. Yes, I am aware, my sweetest, and it is not too far away, but it will not touch our doorstep, I am sure. That's all I needed to hear from you, love. Well, okay, bring the briquettes here then. Briquettes had become a cute name for matted cubes of bracken and fish chunks. Almost a pet name, the fledgling family was nurturing many. Meanings swirled outside their village boundaries like an adolescent tantrum. Cycloptic, cyclonic. Here you are, dear. She handed another one over to him. He stacked it. A bead of sweat popped out from between the 4 or 5 brow lines on John's stolid 40-something forehead. He let it roll. When will they learn? He asked her, ignoring the sweat. Soon enough, John, soon enough. Hours went by like the steady shaft of a surgical stainless steel windshield wiper. And so darkness fell and they held each other like a perpetual knot. 12 Deeper inland. There was a boy that had his favorite toy. It was a small piece of rope with a doll-like puppy fastened to it. His mom had given him some of the magic tea. It had a natural speed in it for the magic, and a type of potent cacao in it, along with some tiny berries juice for sweetness, and to lend to the flavor of the drink. He was just so glad she had let him have some of that potion on this bright, sunny, early afternoon. Happiness was literally busting out of his gut. He hadn't exactly decided to run around very fast and glom on to the one bright thing after another that caught his glittery interest. It just came natural to the young boy of about 7 or 8 years of age. He saw a small girl whose skin looked funny. Hell, even her little face had looked pretty fucking funny to him. That did not, however, trigger aggressive tribal animal instincts, like the mean and ignorant European adults he was one generation away from being related to, because he was too young for that, you see. Being a small boy, in fact, his focus relied fully on the object in her complex and timeless star shapes of hands. Just what exactly was that in her hands? It sure looked special, if it didn't look funny, like her really weird clothes, attitudes, and inculcated activities, unbeknownst to even me. Maybe if he asked her real nice, she would let him hold it. Hey, maybe he could even offer to let her have his string puppy toy. But only for a minute. And then he would definitely need her to give it back. I don't know. It was worth a fucking shot. Who cared if she looked funny? Deeper still, inland, there was a particular clan that had a way about them. A small minority they were, compared to the numbers of the rest of the world, and it had already been foretold that they would be quashed. Not that it was much of a big emotional to-do or upheaval for them. Everything dies, and everything lives. Big deal. But what did matter was that their cultural wisdoms would be squashed out forever. What did matter was the pain of knowing someone went through all kinds of trouble, and really, strife a lot worse than heady annoyance, just to learn a few special and valuable wisdoms. Wisdoms that would soon be carelessly tossed aside. Out of decency, the urge of the clan was to pass those wisdoms on, to save someone else the same fucking troublesome path twists. One of those said wisdoms was that the minute society had learned to learn from the grandmothers among the clan. Of course, that was nothing really special. Many different cultures housed in many different history lines, or alternate history timelines, etc., had picked that up. But there was more to it, some augment they had caught that had really made all the difference. It was something that could have been dismissed as trivial, such as their clan had been, before some thoughtless conquering men had committed genocide in the name of greed and destroyed the former clan that is supposedly not relevant to the rest of this arrogant tale, told by an idiot who keeps breathing the seemingly unstoppable everything all around us, just hoping for the best, more or less, give or take. 14 11 years of softly disguised sorrowful change then proceeded to commence, in the year of 1217. Trouble had been brewing since 1192, like steam built up in an epoxy-sealed metal kettle. As mentioned before, most of the world had grown up enough to discover the value of common decency and the fallacy of prioritizing the pursuit of power. Still, a significant portion of humanity remained lost in confusion to one degree or another. As a result, there were many indigenous factions that feared the coming of change represented by the strange foreigners, now teeming throughout their ancient, cherished, and sacred land. On the other side of the human algebraic equation stood much greater numbers of largely European individuals who wanted to control and oppress the less technologically advanced indigenous people. And to that end, or maybe just as a natural extension of their philosophy, to exploit the resources of the land, etc. Luckily, the decent and fair portion of both the indigenous and the European populations, both on Tora Verrazano and abroad, far exceeded those in the throes of confused illusion. Thus started the Evolutionary War of 1217, which lasted 11 bloody years. Tora, as the first president of the United Countries, had rallied, traveled, marketed, sang, pleaded, begged, and banded together all those who would be decent, people among both the natives of the land and among their new European settler friends and family, now living on Tora Verrazano. They declared independence and with great simultaneity went to civil war, defensively, against all those who sought to oppress, enslave, and exploit. Over in Europe, a near-identical mimic civil war was sparked and quickly grew, like a long-suppressed wild brush fire, consuming the entire planet in the hell of war. The worst of it came to fruition in 1225. Torah managed to keep everyone keeping in their faith, much like a church on a hill in a war-torn realm and time. It looked like there would be no end to the inconsiderate, retarded masculine carnage. But obviously, precipitating a new aeon, the chaos did then finally begin to subside and subdue, never to return to the hearts of men. When the war ended in 1228, Tora was recognized as the greatest power and force of good in the world. Yet, quite rapidly after that recognition came a very conscious global reorganization. Power began to equalize planet-wide, and Zamaka became the capital of the United Countries of Earth in the year 1234. Peace flourished everywhere. 3 years later, Tora sang her last beautiful song as her body perished peacefully, and her soul moved forward and onward to its next port of call. For the next 190 years, from 1237 to 1427, the entire planet developed to reach to the point your world is at now, my dear constant readers. In the time year of 1448 AT, around 250 years after Torah, planet Earth reached a state, or level perhaps, of cosmic utopia, via multi-body prophet waves and other things. The rest is, as they say, history, or maybe a better word, its story. This story, and this book, etc., is dedicated to those who fight in any way against the horror and stupidity that is genocide. Much appreciation. Don't give up. We shall stay confident in the victory of good over evil.